Welcome to another episode of rinaLAB, where we have casual conversations with scientists from Austria. Thank you very much, Claudia Wultsch, for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Claudia, will you tell me what you do now, your title now, and then we'll go back and talk about the inception of that?
So I'm a research associate right now at the City University of New York, and I'm also affiliated with the American Museum of Natural History.
Nice.
I'm a conservation biologist. My work mainly focuses on threatened mammals, which are impacted by humans and environmental change.
Okay, very interesting and intriguing. Before we jump into that, I'd love to know where that inception was. Where did you know that you wanted to start doing this type of research and work?
Yeah, when I first, as a student back in Austria at the University of Graz, I started out studying all kinds of different taxa, a lot of invertebrates, and I was always fascinated by nature. But then I got the great opportunity to go and spend 1 year abroad. I left Austria and I went to Montana. I was always fascinated by the landscapes there and the abundance of wildlife. Mm-hmm. So I joined the wildlife program there at the University of Montana in Missoula. And I got to do a lot of amazing things. We would go out to the field sometimes twice a week. We would do field trips to the Glacier National Park, Yellowstone National Park, and I would see a lot of wildlife in the wild, like even a grizzly bear, and that really changed my interest and perspective. And I think that probably was the turning point for me to start this kind of career.
You were inspired at that point?
I was really inspired.
What was your age again?
Back then I was about 24.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So you got your inspiration about 24, then to start pursuing something.
Yeah, I think that year really changed my life, and then I wanted to pursue that career, mm-hmm. and I didn't know how I will do it because it was definitely challenging going back to Europe. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I am where I am now. So.
You got back to Europe and started down that path.
I finished my master, mm-hmm. and then I wanted to do more international work, and I took a leap and I left to Asia I was there almost a year. I worked for a local NGO in Thailand,
okay.
The Thai Society for Conservation of Wild Animals, and I did what I was taught in Montana to go out and survey for big carnivores. Back then, my focus was bears. So, and there's 2 bear species in Thailand. They are very difficult to find because there are not many of them in the wild. The species are Asiatic black bears and Malayan sun bears. And for this specific NGO, we worked in an area close to the Cambodian border, and we wanted to see if the animals are still there. Because although it was protected, that specific national park, the landscape was degrading, and people didn't know how the wildlife was doing. So we used like some powerful methods to go in the forest and see if the animals are still there. We didn't want it to disturb them, mm-hmm. or capture them, so we used, we call it non-invasive survey methods.
Okay.
So we would put up camera traps. I don't know if have you heard of them? They're like remotely triggered.
I have, but the audience has. I'm from Texas. We do that,
yes,
for deer and other things,
yeah.
But the audience may not. Yeah.
So they're actually remotely triggered. They have a detection sensor, mm-hmm. and some of them also need like a temperature difference. Anyway, so when we set them up in the forest, we get beautiful images of various wildlife, not only the big carnivores, but also the prey, right. Deer, mm-hmm. other things, what they may eat. So we get a sense of what's out there without being really there, right. Disturbing nature and the protected area itself. So that worked out really well. And we started seeing what was in the forest. And that was my first, I would say, experience in the tropics. And I fell in love with the diversity. And I wanted to continue that work. And after Thailand, I joined one of my colleagues from the University of Montana. He actually he did his PhD in Malaysia, in Sabah, in Borneo. And he worked on sun bears too, but also birded pigs. That's like a sympatric pig. Sympatric meaning they eat the same things. So as an ecologist, we want to study both of these species and see how they're doing in that habitat. So I joined him in the Danum Conservation Area in Borneo, which is a fascinating protected area. And it's unfortunately surrounded by a lot of oil palm plantations. So when you fly in there, you see oil palm plantations pretty much everywhere. But then there's some wild protected forest still left. And it was so important for me to see that. And it was probably one of the most stunning areas I've ever been. We saw orangutans, and I saw all kinds of wildlife just being there for a couple months. And it really motivated me to do this work, to continue this work, because I saw there's so much out there, but there's at the same time the wildlife and biodiversity is really very threatened. So we need to not only go and study them, but also do more applied things to help them to conserve what's still left, and it's just dwindling right now. So that's, I would say that's how I got into the field, and that's my main motivation to do this work. Yeah.
Still inspires you every day?
I would say so, yeah. It's not easy to do what I do. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of funding, especially for the international work. There's a lot of bad news every day. We lose tigers on a daily basis.
It's got to be emotional, I would think.
It's emotional, and it's... but at the same time, it just drives you even further, and you just know we need to do this work, and with limited resources, but yeah, and then also to, I think most importantly, encourage and train the next generation. That's also one of my motivations, not only do the work myself, but also spread the passion and train more young scientists to do this work.
Mentors and whatnot.
Yes.
My daughter wants to be a veterinarian because she loves animals, and she's always wanting to know, how do I contribute? I mean, from the time she was I can remember, she's always had a fascination with all kinds of animals. So I'm really anxious to share this with her, because kids do need mentors. They do need to find out what the paths they can go, because they have questions. They're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to get there. So it's fascinating how you do that. How did you fund your way? Is that something that we talked about funding a second ago, which is one thing is you funding your education, but then there's it appears to me that the work itself also needs funding. Yeah,
so that's a very good question. And when I first started my PhD in the States here at Virginia Tech, my PhD was actually, especially my field work, was not funded. We started out with the plan to do a countrywide survey on jaguars, actually in Belize, Central America. And we wanted to do something very new. We wanted to see how jaguars are doing across the country, looking at their DNA, and also setting up camera traps. But the main focus was the genetic work. And so it was back then, talking about 2006, 2007, it was very cutting edge. And because in order to get DNA, in the past, we had to capture animals and handle them. It's not easy to do that with jaguars. And in order to study this kind of animal across the country, we would need to get data on many animals, many individuals. So we took a leap, and my advisor, Marcella Kelly, who's an expert in jaguars, mainly camera trapping, she was like, let's use this new method. And it just came out, but it hasn't really been used in the tropics. So we wanted to use another DNA source, which is not as, back then was not as established, and talking about fecal samples. Mm-hmm. So we decided to do a genetic study based on jaguar fecal samples. And I don't know if you've been to Belize, to this kind of forest habitat. Mm-hmm. It's beautiful, but it's also very thick and lush. And when you go out, there are a lot of leaves on the ground. So it's not an easy area to work. So even when you actually want to find fecal samples on trails where the cats walk, you would still have a very hard time to do that as a human. So we decided to get some help. And we started using sniffer dogs. And so those dogs they were formally trained to detect drugs and bombs. And now for our project, we trained them on cat's cat, or we call cat fecal samples. And we wanted to do this study on jaguars, but since there are 4 other cat species, so we wanted to see how is this cat community doing. So there's mountain lions, jaguarandis, margay's ocelot, and the jaguar. So we trained the dog on all 5 cat species, the fecal samples, and that was the main objective. To do this work and to get the funding was very challenging because back then nobody has really done it. Plus, people told me, oh, it's in the tropics, it's going to be hot, the dogs are going to be overheating. And then when you find fecal samples in this kind of habitat, and especially the climate, hot and humid, is basically the worst DNA you would get.
Really?
Yeah, because heat and humidity degrades DNA. Right. And then plus we're talking about, we're not taking blood samples, we're taking fecal samples. So whatever we collect, it's already really degraded. So there were a lot of challenges, and based on that challenges, we had a hard time to get funding. But we got it off the ground. We had a successful pilot season. And after that, it was easier to get funds, but I had to do a lot of grant writing. And I think that was very challenging. And it was definitely not a PhD where I came in and everything was funded.
Right.
Yeah, so it was...
You were trailblazing.
I was,
in
I had to.
Science.
Yes.
I like that.
Yeah,
that
poop science. I never thought I would do poop science, but now I'm a very big advocate.
You own it. You're a trailblazer. That's awesome.
I think a lot of people are using this method now. And also by using the dogs, it was just a wonderful experience. It was very hard work, but we got a lot of data, and I think we know a lot more about jaguars at this point.
So what can you tell us about jaguars now, other than...
So we know now for the areas where we worked in how many cats are there, because we can, when we extract the DNA from fecal samples, we actually get DNA of the host, the predator, because it comes from sloughed off cells from the intestinal system. But then we can also learn, over the last few years, I targeted different DNA in the fecal samples. So when we do extractions, we can also look at the DNA of the prey, what they eat. So that's really important too for large predators, because they're on the top of the food chain. So we really need to monitor what they eat in different areas, because they need certain prey, and if the prey is not there anymore, the populations may be more threatened. So we can learn a lot from poop. And then recently I started looking at microbial DNA, which is also present in poop samples. And that gives us some indication what's going on in the gut. So I don't know if you heard of microbiome research.
I haven't, no. And
that's like, it's a very new frontier for humans. Now we know a lot about our microbiome. So when you look at your body, we actually have a large portion of the cells in us and on us, they're microbial. Mm-hmm. And so it's now over the last 10 years, especially in human studies, we found out that bacteria, they're not only pathogens. We have a lot of commensal bacteria, good bacteria, and they help us to, especially in the gut, help us to digest food, help us to synthesize other nutrients, vitamins. But they're also responsible for some diseases, like they could show that certain microbes are present when you have cancer or when you're autistic. So microbes have a lot of functions, and we are just at the beginning to learn and understand what they can do. And I'm trying to use this new method now and apply also for wildlife, because in wild populations, we know there's a lot of bacteria there too, similar to humans, but they're really understudied. So, and since a lot of these big carnivores and also smaller ones, they're facing so many threats right now. So we really need to understand their biology thoroughly. And at this point now, we know that their biology is driven by not only the cat themselves, also by microbes living in and on them. So poop allows us to study that too. And so I'm a big advocate of poop science, and I'll continue using this sample source, a biological sample. Yeah, it gives us a lot of information.
How else would you test for those microbial things in humans and also in cats? Is it, other than poop, going back to a human, does any of the traditional, scanners, obviously x-rays wouldn't do it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So historically we cultured bacteria, but some of the bacteria you cannot really culture. So now this is possible to do. This research is possible because we had a huge advancement in technology. So over the last, it's now 15 years, basically, we have this new type of sequencer. They're called next generation sequencers, where we can generate millions of DNA reads in one sequencing run, and we can put a lot of samples into, we pull them together, and then we generate millions of DNA reads. And this allows us now to really examine complex samples like microbiome sample. For example, a gut can have anywhere between 500 to 1,000 different microbial species. So we need to have this kind of technology to really see what's there. In terms of how, you asked me what other alternatives there are to sampling. For humans now, I mainly talked about gut microbiome, but of course there's many other environments on our body. Yep. So we can study different sites. For example, the armpit has very unique microbial community compared to the gut or compared to the mouth. So in order to really understand our microbiome, we need to really take swab samples from various sites. And so that's how we would do it for humans. For animals, that's more difficult. And we have been now collaborating with some researchers who are capturing animals. Mm-hmm. So we get swab samples from different
areas of their body,
species, and different sites, different body sites. Because for many of them, they have never been studied before. And it's fascinating because we seem to find a lot of new biodiversity.
I have a question about funding because, as we were talking earlier, I'm an entrepreneur, founder, yes. And I'm always problem solving in my own way. One of the things that both in startups and what I'm hearing here is funding's an issue.
Mm-hmm. It's a big issue, yeah.
And so I'm trying to solve that somehow, and by asking questions, mm-hmm. right, how it's done. If a person like yourself is trying to do funding, you mentioned grant writing. Mm-hmm. Is there a directory that you go through and say, I'm going to write all these grants? Or is there other things like crowdsourcing, for example? That's very popular in funding a business. Is there things like that people can do to help mm-hmm. the cause? Yeah,
so I would say crowdfunding can be done, but it's more difficult. There's certain grants you can apply for. There are some directories you can look up, different zoo grants, or some NGOs would have grant programs for graduate students, or there's different organizations. So I would say there's a wealth of knowledge out there. It can be very confusing when you first start with this work. So I was fortunate when I was in graduate school, my advisor, she guided me, and we would look for grants together. Right. And now I would say, after all this time, there's new ways to do this. And I would say I really want to highlight Twitter, the Twitter community. Well, so I'm a big fan of social media, where we, especially in this field, we have very strong science community where people share their experience with grant writing, help each other, but also organizations would post grant submission deadlines. So I think there's new ways now to find out about this kind of resources. And I told you before, it's very complex. There's a lot of sources and things change sometimes every year. people run out of funding, and then this grant is offered this year, but then it may not. So it's really good. Social media is very powerful in that way to kind of keep on top of things, because there's a lot out there, but sometimes you just don't know. So
it seems like it's disconnected. I mean, that's an area that, and it's not just in this community. I see it in other areas too. There's this organization of information, even though we have access to the internet and Twitter and social media. How do you reach all the people that are interested? And it seems like there's not this one directory that says, here's all the places that are willing to do grants, and go on, and here's a single form that you can just hit a button and everything is done. And there's this other thing to crowdsource, because there's a lot of public. I would imagine that in the audience we're going to have people that I want to contribute. How do I help? And it's equally as important to give them the tools to know where to go to be able to help. It seems like there's this, and I may be wrong, but what that seems to me is that there's a disconnect there.
There's a disconnect, and I think some people, they compile sources for fundings, but things just change quickly. So it's really difficult to stay on top. And I think social media is one good way to do it.
Helping a lot,
has been helping a lot,
Yeah, interesting. So tell me what it's like to work for the American Museum of Natural History in New York.
It's a fascinating place. There's a lot of resources, a lot of great minds at the same place. It's a hub in the city for science and natural resource conservation management. We get a lot of people from all over the world visiting. So since I've been there, I've met so many different people from different places studying all kinds of things. So and then plus we have huge collections, so you can find pretty much anything you want. We also have great initiatives for education, so that has been very inspiring for me. We not only do the research there, but we do a lot of outreach, and we work with students a lot. I've been part of I just want to highlight one program which I've been part of the last several years already. It's the Science Research Mentoring Program. It's a program where the museum invites high school students.
Nice.
And we have about 60 high school students every year join the museum, and they get paired. Two students always get paired with one museum researcher, and they stay with us from September almost a year until June, and they work with the scientists on research projects, and it's all about mentoring, what we discussed before. So it's a very powerful way for these young people to do their get exposed for the first time to science and be a researcher at a very early age. So there's many really good things about the museum, but education is very important, and has really had a big impact on me too as a mentor, and I hope to continue similar work wherever I go next.
So this program of mentorship for the high school kids, is that, I would imagine it's a local program, because
it's a local
they work
program.
with you on a one-on-one basis, or
they're all based in New York City.
Okay.
And it's very diverse. We have a lot of minority students. We have a lot of female students too. So it's very diverse, and the kids are very smart. They have been, like the microbiome research I just explained to you before. My students are working with me on this kind of very complex genomic data, and they're doing this at an age of 17, and they get to do their own research project, and we have a symposium at the end of the year where they present a poster and give a talk. And then many of them go on to college and continue a similar path. So it has been a great experience to work in the museum for many reasons.
What is the most fascinating thing you've seen out in the jungle when you're doing your work?
That's a good question. I've seen a lot of things. I would say probably the most fascinating thing was in 2010. I was fortunate to join this a filming expedition actually with BBC. I got this call one day. They invited me and my detector dog Bruiser to join a filming expedition to Bhutan, which is this small kingdom in the Himalayas. And the main goal was to study tigers and other big cats. And Bruiser, my dog Bruiser, and I were invited to help the camera team find these big cats out in the tropical part of Bhutan, which is the south, Royal Manas National Park. So I joined the team, and we spent many days out in the field. And one day we would actually, across the river, we would see an Asiatic black bear female with her cub climbing up a hillside. And it was probably one of the fascinating things I've ever seen, because this usually don't get to see in the wild. And it was just this stunning area where we had large diversity of animals. And and we just came across this site, and it still stays with me a lot, all the time.
That's amazing. I was in my mind, I was kind of lost, because I was just imagining what you had seen. Okay, impact. At the end of the day, I'm hearing the work that you're doing, and the science and the learning that you've done with these animals. But one of the impacts that humans have in this, how do you educate the public, or what do you want to see change, or what impact do you have?
Humans have a lot of impact on wildlife. There's a lot of things we can do. I think most importantly is for us as a wildlife biologist, we work with local communities living at the doorstep of the protected areas where large carnivores live, and we try to educate them. There's a lot of conflict in some of those areas, because the large predators may occasionally take out livestock. So I think going in, working with those with these local communities, and show them how to keep the livestock safe on a daily basis really helps to mitigate the issue. So I think working with local communities is really important. Recently, we also started a project in New York City, or the project has been going on for many years already, but I joined them. It's the Gotham Coyote City, New York City research project, where there are coyotes in New York. And a lot of people don't know it. So we also do a lot of outreach with the public, and we just tell them, don't be afraid of coyotes. They're not going to come and get you. And I think that really helps too. So I think it's a lot about educating people, and then people who live close to these predators. At the same time, I think also training the next generation of scientists who will go out and do more work. A lot of work needs to be done, and it's probably not going to get better, and it's not going to get easier with all the challenges we are facing right now. I'm talking about climate change and forest disappearing at an alarming rate. So I would say that's probably the biggest impact we have, is to work with people who live close to these predators, but also to train the next generation of scientists.
Having said that, what would you say to the audience, the people in the audience, the kids in the audience that want to listen, or even parents that have kids like myself? What would you say, what advice would you give them if they want to pursue something like what you're doing?
I think I probably recommend kids to get involved in local research projects. Try to get, there's organizations, maybe in your local towns. There may be a museum. There are a lot of opportunities out there. You just need to go and look. Universities sometimes have also outreach events. So I think just get involved with these things and go out and do it. And I think you'll just get captivated. I just always remember my high school students. They all grew up in New York City. Many of them haven't been outside in the forest a lot. So they get captivated just by listening to the stories I tell them. And I think the more you do, the more you get exposed it helps you to find out what you want to do. But then also, hopefully, you'll get involved in this kind of work and decide to continue being a scientist, or even work with threat and wildlife, which there's lots of things needs to get done. So
yeah, and at the end of the day, what I'm hearing you say is that go try things and see what your heart tells you.
Yes.
Because back to your experience, it was that 1 year when you were 24 when your life changed because
Yes.
you were inspired to do something, and ever since then, it gives you that reason to go get up every morning and go do something, find that cause.
yeah.
And so for kids and the parents that are listening out there as well, and that want to have an impact, is expose them to the museum. See, that's interesting because in my limited knowledge of museums, I think it's just a place you go to and see things that have happened in the past. I don't think about that this is also a center where you can go actively do something now, other than maybe donate some money or whatnot. But you're saying actually go see what programs they offer and be involved there. So that's...
Yes, there's there are a lot of opportunities, and I think it's not only museums, also other organizations. I think it's all about going out there and see what's there. And then it's also, I think, again, I come back to social media, where I think it's about trying to find out what's out there. And maybe we all need to do a better job just reaching out more to the public, so it's even more well known that there are all these resources and kids can go and do. And I think that's basic. I tell my students, go and do and try, go and do things, because even when you're a biology student and undergraduate student, you still don't know what you want to do. So tell them, go and do internships and help with work in different research groups. And then I think it will help you to decide what to do, because you really don't know.
Right.
You're young, and so it's all about getting exposed and go and do things.
That was such a beautiful message, because I think, and I'm speaking from the heart here, because I've got a 15-year-old that's having to go through these things, and seeing her struggles and trying to figure things out, and the pressure that she's thinking about on a daily basis. 1 week she wants to do one thing, the next week she wants to do another. And quite frankly, in social media that's out there, pop culture does a great way of exposing all the things that don't matter, and keeps attention of teenagers. And I think there should be a lot more of what you're saying. I'm glad that social media is being helpful in raising awareness, but we need to do a better job of that, so that kids can start having planted that seed of, maybe I want to do this, and what's the next step? Because I think it's that what's the next step question mark that kids have. Mm-hmm. And so I find this very, very fascinating. Thank you so much for being with us. I really have enjoyed this show and learned so much. And I will follow you on social media and keep spreading the word.
Thanks for having me. It was a really great experience.